Welcome everyone to the Dr. Spook's channel, where horror stories live. I have returned to fill your free time and to be your companion when you drift off to sleep. So if you are new here, I will be delighted if you subscribe and support us by clicking the like button and leaving a nice comment so that YouTube's algorithms get to know us and the video can spread. Now close your eyes and listen. In 1969, a journalist from an adventure magazine named Milt McLean traveled to the island of New Guinea with his film crew to shoot a documentary about a missing person who had disappeared in that area. Milt's hope was to find the missing person, film him, and create a big buzz for his documentary. However, despite filming a lot and searching everywhere, they found no trace of the missing person. In the end, Milt returned home and put all the footage he shot in his storage. But 40 years later, the footage was taken out of storage because another film crew wanted to make a documentary about the missing person. When they watched this footage, they discovered something shocking that no one could believe. Today I will tell you the story of what they discovered, and more importantly, what this thing revealed about the missing person. And I'll tell you now that it's something very scary. Let's begin today's story. On the morning of Saturday, November 18th, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller grabbed the pull cord connected to the outboard motor of the boat he was riding. He was pulling the cord over and over, but the engine wouldn't start. And as long as the engine wasn't working, it meant that Michael and his small team were continuing to drift far out to sea. But this wasn't the worst thing about this situation. The boat that Michael and his team were on, which was a 40-foot twin-hulled catamaran, had started sinking minutes earlier. Michael and his team had been happily traveling along the beautiful green coast of New Guinea when they had to cross an area where the waters were particularly turbulent. There was a river in New Guinea that emptied into a sea called the Arafura Sea, and this is where Michael and his team were. When the brown river water meets the blue sea water, very strong waves occur between them. When Michael and his team tried to cross this area, the waves hit the boat and flooded the engine, which stopped working. And as more and more of these waves entered the boat began to sink. The reason they risked this in the first place was that Michael wanted to go see a tribe called the Asmat tribe. Asmat is the English name of the tribe, but the Arabic name known for it, or what Arabs call it, is the Asmat tribe. The tribe lived on the coast right after this area where the river was. Michael was obsessed with the art this tribe made, especially the unique wooden poles they crafted. The skilled craftsmen in the tribe made these poles by taking a single piece of wood, which was an entire tree trunk, and continuing to carve it until it looked like a group of men standing on each other's shoulders. These poles are very beautiful, complex, and amazing. They make them because they believe they contain the spirits of warriors from their tribe who died in battles, and for the Asmat tribe to avenge the spirits of their warriors from their enemies, these statues remain as they are in their place. They never sell these statues or throw them away. They remain part of their culture and community. But Michael thought he had succeeded in negotiating a deal to exchange his things for one of these poles. But although he gave them all the things he offered them, they didn't sell him the pole he wanted. So now Michael was returning in hopes that he could take the pole from them and take it with him on the boat. But now he was sitting in his sinking boat and seeing the muddy shores of New Guinea Island getting further and further away because his boat was drifting inland. Michael's team consisted of 3 other people, a French anthropologist named René and 2 teenage guides from the Asmat tribe named Simon and Leo. After Michael failed to start the engine, everyone tried pulling the engine cord, but they couldn't start it. Finally, Simon and Leo spoke up and told Michael and René that the only hope now was to leave the boat and jump into the sea and swim to the shore, which was 800 meters away. But they were drifting away quickly, and if they waited any longer, they would be too far from the shore. But René wasn't a good swimmer, and Michael wasn't ready to leave the boat and leave all the things on it like tobacco, fishing lines, clothes, sweets, and all the things he knew the Asmat tribe didn't have, and which he could use as a means of negotiating to get the pole or any other art they might offer. When Michael realized that the boat and everything on it would sink into the sea at some point, He wasn't psychologically ready to leave the boat now. So they decided that the asthmatic teenagers would jump off the boat and swim to the shore to get help, and during this time Michael and Renee would wait for them on the boat. Moments later, the teenagers jumped into the water and started swimming towards the shore, and Michael was watching them. And suddenly, Michael realized how far he was from home. He had gone months without showering, and he smelled very bad, and his body was covered with sunburns and dirt, and his hands were rough and cracked from so much rowing. But this wasn't Michael's real life, because he wasn't an ordinary person. His family was one of the most famous and richest families in history. The Rockefeller family was in the top 10 list of the most powerful families ever. Michael's grandfather, named John D. Rockefeller, was one of the world's oil tycoons and was the richest man in the world in his time. His father, named Nelson Rockefeller, was governor of New York and became vice president of the United States in the future. But although his family owned this huge fortune, Michael wasn't interested in how his family made money. He loved adventure and the wilderness in New Guinea. He had come here for the first time 7 months ago with a team of Harvard filmmakers to make a documentary about a very remote tribe. Michael fell in love with this adventure, although on this trip, while filming a battle between this tribe and another tribe with them, he was hit by an arrow in his shoulder. Despite being injured in the battle, Michael loved New Guinea. He didn't tell his family that he was hit by the arrow because he was afraid that his powerful Rockefeller family would take revenge on the tribe that hit him. He was keen to protect the people he met in New Guinea and considered them like his family, and more than his real family. After the Harvard team finished the documentary and returned to America, Michael stayed in New Guinea. At that time, his father, Nelson Rockefeller, opened a museum in New York that displayed art from primitive places like New Guinea. In the early 60s, Americans considered the indigenous people of New Guinea Island, like the Asmat tribe, very primitive and backward people. And this was the reason that attracted people to the new museum in New York. They wanted to know how these primitive tribes lived. This is where Michael's idea came from to collect the statues, arts, and tools made by the Asmat tribe and send them to his father to display in his museum. And of course, these things made by the Asmat tribe were not displayed in any museum in the world at that time in the 60s. Of course, things like this were a very big gain for him and his family, whether it was a gain for fame or financial gain. Michael collaborated with a French anthropologist named Renee to tour New Guinea and collect this art and send it to his father. Hours after Leo and Simon jumped into the water from the sinking boat and started swimming towards the shore, Michael and Renee didn't know if they would reach the shore at all. They didn't see anyone coming to rescue them and didn't know if they were close to help or not. They were seeing their boat sink more and more into the water. At one point, Michael and Renee decided to grab buckets and start emptying the water from the boat, but this was of no use. The water was entering the boat too quickly, and then a sudden wave came and completely overturned the boat and threw Michael and Renee into the sea. Michael and Renee managed to swim to the surface of the water and return to the overturned boat. There was an air pocket under the boat, and this was keeping it afloat. Michael held on to the boat and also to a gasoline can that was on the boat and tied it to his belt to be a means of flotation, and the two of them became clinging to the overturned boat, and Michael was hoping that Simon and Leo would reach the shore and bring help. But Michael knew that if help didn't come soon, he would have to take a radical solution like trying to swim to the shore himself, which was now very far away, about 800 meters. The next morning, they were still in the water, clinging to the boat and waiting for rescue, but no rescue came. Michael was an excellent swimmer, but at this point he knew they were at least 8 or 16 kilometers from shore. So this would be a very long swim in turbulent waters. He started telling Renee that he would do this swim, and that he could do it even if it was 20 kilometers. Renee was begging him not to go and leave him alone, but Michael told him he had to do something. All Renee could do was watch Michael take off some of his clothes and add the gas can to his belt to help him float more. And after that, Michael said goodbye to Renee. He started swimming around 8 a.m. on Sunday, November 19, 1961, After 12 hours, René was still clinging to the boat and waiting for rescue, and suddenly the sky lit up with a very bright light. A plane had seen him and fired a flare and told him they saw him and that they would send help. And after an hour, a boat came and rescued René. When he got on the boat, he was very relieved and asked the captain if Michael Rockefeller was with them. The captain said to him, "Who? This Michael? We haven't been informed of anything about him, and we haven't seen him." We must remember that Michael Rockefeller was from the powerful Rockefeller family. And when René heard that they didn't know Michael's whereabouts, he told the captain that Michael had started the long swim to the shore to get help. Here it was as if a bomb had exploded in the Rockefeller family. The family mobilized all their money, resources, and influence to launch the largest search campaign for Michael. They sent ships, helicopters, and planes and contacted the U.S. Navy, which fully participated. They searched everywhere for a week, but they couldn't find Michael. The search for Michael continued for years, but there was always someone searching for him in the area where he started his swim. After 3 years of Michael's disappearance, the Rockefeller family accepted the reality that he probably drowned and died during his long swim towards the shore. When the family finally accepted that this is what happened to their son, this story became the most circulated in America about what happened to Michael Rockefeller. Even his sister wrote a best-selling book about her grief over losing her brother. But in New Guinea, there were completely different stories that began to spread about what happened to Michael. Different rumors about his fate were spreading on the maritime trade routes in that area, and the many adventure magazines were reporting these stories. In 1969, 5 years after Michael's family announced his death, a journalist from an adventure magazine named Milt McLean heard from a mysterious Australian person that he had recently seen Michael Rockefeller in the New Guinea jungle. Milt followed this lead even though it wasn't reliable, and traveled to New Guinea with a film crew and roamed the area and searched everywhere for Michael. That is, he actually combed or surveyed the area, but he found no trace of Michael. So he returned to his country very frustrated and wrote a successful book about his journey to search for Michael Rockefeller. But he didn't review the footage he shot with his camera on that trip. He and his team filmed everything from afar and up close, but they didn't review these films. They said, "That's it, since we didn't find Michael," and they put them on the shelf. But after 40 years, there was another film crew who decided to go to New Guinea and search for Michael, because there were still rumors spreading that he was still alive in the jungles of New Guinea. So before this team went to New Guinea, they discovered the footage that Milt McLean had shot and hadn't watched. So they watched all this footage and reviewed it well, and discovered something that was shocking and no one could believe. Among hours and hours of recordings, there was a small shot that was filmed from afar. The team was filming on the ground towards the water, and they saw boats appearing in the picture, and they were full of Asmat tribe warriors. This was a war team probably heading for a battle with another tribe. But among the big, strong warriors, there was a person different from them, and it was clear from his appearance that he wasn't from the Asmat tribe or from the island's inhabitants at all. He was a white man, and it was clear that he was Michael Rockefeller. When the news of this footage spread quickly, rumors spread all over the world that the heir to the huge fortune decided to leave his rich family and live with the Asmat tribe as one of them. But again, we have no idea if this was actually Michael Rockefeller or not. It could be a religious missionary or any other white person who was in New Guinea. But the story was exciting and spread everywhere. In 2012, 4 years after the discovery of Milt McLean's videos, and more than 50 years after Michael Rockefeller's disappearance, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman, who had been obsessed with the mystery of Michael Rockefeller's disappearance since his childhood, decided to go to New Guinea and finally discover what happened to Michael Rockefeller. After Carl and his translator lived with the Asmat tribe, they warned them that if he told this story to anyone, the entire village might be killed, and maybe he would be killed too, so he promised them that. But Carl didn't listen to this. He returned from New Guinea and wrote a book about the story called Savage Harvest, and this is what happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of November 19, 1961, about 24 hours after Michael jumped into the sea and started his long swim towards the shore. 3 elders of the Asmat tribe named Katalai, Van and Jim and Bob, with 50 members of the tribe in 8 long boats, were just returning with a break at the mouth of the river, which is the same river that emptied into the Arafura Sea, the place where Michael and his team faced the waves that overturned their boat and led to this situation. All the tribe members were returning in the boats. Some of them were smoking loosely rolled cigars, and they were all almost naked, wearing only some strips of cloth around their ankles and elbows, and some of them had holes in their noses and ears. But suddenly one of the tribe elders noticed something moving in the sea. It was something white moving towards them. He immediately called on the others to watch this thing and told them it was a white crocodile or snake or something unknown. They all looked and watched this white thing moving towards them. They didn't want to stay in their place until this thing surprised them, so the whole group started moving with the paddles towards this thing. When they reached this thing, some of them had raised their spears, but when they saw this creature, they realized it wasn't a crocodile or a snake or anything strange. It was a white man swimming on his back. It was Michael Rockefeller swimming on his back and wearing the gas can to help him float. And he looked strange. When he saw them all, they were shocked because they thought it was something dangerous. But after that, when they saw him and made sure he wasn't a threat to them, Michael, who was sleeping on his back in the water, turned on his side and saw the tribe he was watching from the beginning as they approached him. He grabbed one of their boat paddles, and immediately Bob, one of the elders, looked at Michael, who was holding the boat. Then he looked at Van and Jim, the other 2 village elders, as if they understood from his eyes what he wanted to tell them. They started nodding in agreement. Bob helped Michael climb into the boat, and Michael sat in the middle of the boat and was very exhausted from swimming, but he was very comfortable and reassured. So he kept sitting in his place, and the tribe members returned to their places in their boats and started paddling to return to the river. And while they were paddling, they started chanting a very strange chant. All 8 boats and all 50 tribe members started chanting this chant together. Michael was hearing this chant or hymn for the first time and tried to ask them, "What are you saying, guys?" But they completely ignored him and continued paddling and chanting. Michael was enjoying the singing and feeling happy and safe as he was lying with his body on the boat. But suddenly the chanting stopped and the boat started moving towards a small bay on the shore. Michael noticed that they slowed down in their movement, so he tried to get up to see if they had reached the village or not. But when he got up and looked over the edge of the boat, he didn't see any village on the shore. But he was just seeing a bay, or an empty area on the shore. Michael started, and he put his hand out for anyone in the village to come with him and rescue Renee. He thought he would find Simon and Leo in the village. Michael started asking them if they would help him rescue Renee. But there was something strange and big between them, and they didn't understand him. And at one point, one of the Asmat tribe men started laughing at Michael, and the others started laughing with him. Michael didn't understand what was happening, and before he could do anything, the entire tribe stopped laughing. And in a moment, they returned to their chant or hymns as they slowly headed towards the shore. Michael started to feel danger, and instead of getting off the boat with the rest of the tribe, he stayed lying on the boat, and he was afraid as if he was trying to get away from them. The man who first laughed at Michael stood over him chanting and smiling, then raised his spear and plunged it into Michael's side. As soon as he did that, the tribe members raised the horns they were carrying and started. He didn't have the strength to push himself. He tried to roll to the other side of the boat to protect himself, but the man raised his spear again while smiling and struck him in his other side after pulling the spear out of him. Michael was in severe pain, so he lifted himself up and jumped from the boat into the mud and tried to get up to escape from them. But there was nowhere he could go as he tried to stand in the mud. 2 of the tribesmen came behind him and grabbed him under his arms and began dragging him from the shore towards the forest. Their rhythmic chanting continued, and every so often Michael would hear the sound of their horns. At that moment he was being dragged to the forest, and finally they brought him to an open area in the forest away from the village. They placed him in the middle of this open area and sat him on his knees. Michael was trying to protect his sides with his arms and was very weak. The tribe then formed a circle around him and continued their chanting. At one point, one of the tribe members approached Michael and grabbed his head and lowered it down until his neck, exposing his neck, and another from the tribe came forward and raised his axe and brought it down on Michael's neck. It seems that the Asmat tribe knew Michael, and they remembered him from his visit months ago when he tried to trade with them to take their poles. They were very angry that this rich white man came to them thinking he could buy their sacred items as if he was taking something trivial from them to put in his museum. They felt deeply insulted for their sacred objects and held a great hatred in their hearts. That's why they didn't sell him the pole he wanted. But when Michael suddenly appeared before them, they killed him, but they killed him with their rituals to avenge the spirits of their warriors whose spirits the pole contained. Because many warriors were killed by white men in the past, Michael was a means of revenge. The chant Michael heard was the chant they do when they perform execution rituals. But they didn't just kill Michael. After the man struck the axe on his neck, another from the tribe grabbed his hair and lifted his head and cut his neck with a knife until he separated his head from his body. After separating his head, the tribe members came forward and began cutting his body into pieces, in different groups, and quickly they lit a fire and cooked and ate Michael. Among all the parts of his body that they ate, his brain was the most important. The 3 elders of the tribe, Van, Jim, and Bob, were the only ones allowed to eat the brain or head. After they ate and were full, they took the remaining meat and wrapped it in plant leaves to eat later. Elder Van took his skull to the village and covered it with banana leaves and painted or drew on it and made it like a souvenir. A few days later, when the big expedition passed through the area searching for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew that they couldn't talk about what happened to Michael, because if this matter spread, it was very possible that the Americans would take revenge on them and kill the entire tribe, including everyone in it. So this secret remained hidden for years and years, until Carl Hoffman from National Geographic published the book about this story and called it Savage Harvest. There are people who read this book and doubted this story because initially Michael disappeared in mysterious circumstances, and then this story appeared on the tongues of the Asmat tribe people. But to this day, the Rockefeller family and American authorities say that Michael drowned while swimming as he was trying to find help. There is one door at my old school before I graduated from middle school that was always locked. Not once did I see it open. There are many rumors about what lies on the other side of the door, such as an abandoned military bunker, a torture chamber, and my least favorite, another janitor's closet. Whenever I walked past the door, I always got this eerie feeling that I could not explain, but the feeling came as quickly as it disappeared. One day as I was preparing to go home and about to leave school, I walked past the door, but this time I did not have the eerie feeling I had before. I turned my eyes towards the door to examine it, and I saw that there was a slight opening in the door. Out of curiosity, I waited until no one was around, and I stepped inside to investigate. I knew my mom would not mind if I was not home right after school because I usually go to one of my friends' house to play video games. To this very day, what I saw in that room still makes me wish I ignored the door and went home. It was pitch black as I entered the room. I looked for a light switch, but there was none, so I then pulled out my phone that was only at 10% and turned on the flash. The light from my phone revealed stairs that were carved from medieval stone bricks, the same as the walls. Curiosity struck me even harder, and I decided to walk down the stairs. As I walked down the stairs, the eerie feeling came back, and the further I went down, the stronger it became. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard a loud bang. I did not pay much attention to it, but I wish I had. I continued walking down and finally reached the bottom. I looked at my phone and saw I had only 5% left, and it had taken me 15 minutes to walk down the stairs. I shone the light from my phone to see that the stairs had led me to a long tunnel lined with torches, with a wooden door at the end. In the corner of the tunnel I saw a light switch, with my phone now at 4%. I turned my phone and flash off and then flipped the switch. The torches turned on and light illuminated the room. I walked through the long tunnel, and as I reached the door at the end, the eerie feeling faded away. I slowly opened the door so that only one eye could show. The room was so dark that the only thing I could see was a pedestal and something on the floor. I heard someone coming, so I opened the door and slowly closed it behind me. Then I ran to hide behind something in the darkness. Now that I was hidden, I could see that the something on the floor was cult-like writing in red paint, or what I thought was paint. The doors opened, and two robed figures entered the room. One was dragging a long black garbage bag, and the other was holding some sort of book. The one dragging the bag stopped dragging it and entered the darkness. The one holding the book put it on the pedestal and yelled out, "You got the table yet?" "Almost," said the other. I examined the bag and saw that there was a pale hand poking out. Out of fear, I covered my mouth and waited until the one by the pedestal was distracted, and fearing that I would die, I silently walked to the door to escape. As I was just about to reach the door, the other robbed figure that was in the shadows grabbed me. "So there was someone in here after all," said the figure in a raspy voice. "I guess so," said the other in a calm voice. "What are you going to do to me?" I yelled as I was trying to break free from the robbed figure's grasp, but it did not work. "It's not us you need to worry about, it's them," said the one beside the pedestal in a malicious tone. The lights turned on and illuminated the room to reveal two pale, 7 feet tall, human-like creatures standing. They had no eyes, no ears, only an extremely long, malicious smile and a crooked nose. The robed figure released his grasp on me and went to join his ally. I tried to move and get out of there, but my body was stuck, and I was paralyzed with fear. The human-like creatures started to approach me, and I fought to move my body. As I fought, I realized that while I was hiding in the darkness, I was actually hiding behind one of the creatures. One figure was now close enough that it stretched out his hand and nearly touched me. Before it could, I was able to break out of my paralyzed state and move. I opened the door and darted out of the room as fast as I could. I reached the stairs within seconds and looked back to see the figures running down the tunnel. I turned my head back towards the stairs and ran up quickly. I was halfway up the stairs when they let out an ear-piercing screech. I reached the top of the stairs to now realize the noise that I heard earlier was the door being closed. My heart was racing now. The door would not open. I pounded on it with all my might. Behind me I could hear the creatures quickly approaching. Right when I thought all hope was lost, the door opened, and I darted out of there. I quickly closed the door shut and looked to thank whoever opened the door, but no one was there. A week later, a lot of staff and students were appearing to go missing, so the cops searched the school. When they opened the door and checked the room, nothing was there except for a letter on the pedestal saying, "We will find you, kid." Later that week it was revealed that the door could have only been opened from the outside. That made me wonder how exactly did the door open, because there was no one on the other side that could open it for me. A couple years have passed now. I have decided to write this to document what happened to me because I think they have found me. For the last week now, I have been sleeping with a 6-inch knife under my pillow because I have been seeing the creatures late at night in my room, hunched over my bed, maliciously smiling. I don't know how long I have left before they take me, but I won't go out without a fight. It was my 3rd week as a ranger in Yosemite, back in '78. Fresh out of the academy, a little green, but not too bad at figuring out trails. Plus, let's be honest, who couldn't get used to those views every day? It wasn't the glorious peaks or waterfalls that got me, though. I liked the quiet of Yosemite Valley, the way you could hear birds even with the folks milling around, the thick smell of the pines. That was my jam. The weirdness started with Gary. Old Gary was a park hand, been around since like the park opened or something. Anyway, he found me checking the signage on Lower Yosemite Fall Trail. He usually kept to himself, so it was a surprise to see him out of his normal haunts. "Say, Ethan," Gary rasped, voice sounding rusty. "Ever go back behind the falls?" "Nah, not really," I said, adjusting a loose sign. "Not much point when you get this view right here, right?" He cackled, this kind of wet, phlegmy sound. "Maybe not point for everyone," he muttered. "Maybe those falls hide more than water." Before I could ask more than water like what, Gary was gone. He moved quick for an old guy. Weird cat, I thought, chuckling to myself at the old-timer with his cryptic messages. But Gary's words stuck with me. I mean, he wouldn't have said something like that for nothing, right? Yosemite was big. You never knew what critters were lurking in the back country. Couple days later, I was taking stock of bear canisters at a campsite when I spotted a figure deeper in the woods. Now folks wander off all the time, but there was a hunched strangeness to this one. Plus, they moved like they knew what they were doing, like maybe they shouldn't be back there. I shrugged, more on instinct than anything, and headed after them. The trees swallowed us right up, the only sound my boots on the trail and that figure shuffling ahead. Every once in a while they'd glance back. They couldn't see me well in the dim light, but they sensed someone was there. Then, just as quick as they showed up, they were gone, like vanished into thin air. Back at camp, a sinking feeling gnawed at my guts. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my newbie jitters. That same night, though, I couldn't shake the image of what I'd seen, or rather not seen, when the figure glanced back. Instead of eyes, there were just these deep, empty sockets. It wasn't an illusion of light. I knew that much. The next few days went by in a blur. Routine patrols, fixing signs, standard ranger stuff. But those empty eyes haunted me. It's funny how your brain works, isn't it? You think you're tough, all prepared, but then something real weird comes along and you're back to sleeping with the light on. Me? I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching me, a presence in the trees just lurking. I was starting to spook myself. Then came the call late one night. It was Gary on the park radio, his voice shaking like a leaf. "Ethan, it's back. God help me, it's back," he gasped. The thing behind the falls, it took Davy. Who's Davy, I wanted to ask, but then it hit me. Davy was one of the seasonal guys, young kid full of jokes and energy. And now gone? Gary's voice cut through the static, frantic and desperate. "We gotta find him, Ethan. Please, I can't let it take anyone else." The line went dead. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fear replaced with a grim determination. Gary wasn't one to blow things out of proportion. Something was wrong, seriously wrong. It took me half an hour to get to the base of Lower Yosemite Fall. The moon barely cut through the thick canopy of trees, making the forest eerie and disorienting. Gary's pickup sat there, abandoned, headlights still on. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the woods for any sign of him or Davy. My heart pounded in my ears, every rustle a potential threat. "Gary?" I shouted into the dark, but only echoing silence answered me. I moved deeper into the forest, flashlight beam flickering over the trail leading towards the waterfall. Even amidst the panic, I couldn't help but take a breath. The waterfall roared into the night, mist swirling up, catching the moonlight like an ethereal veil. And then a flicker of movement in the mist near the base of the falls. Instinctively, I ducked behind a boulder, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm in my ears. Peeking out, I could make out a dark shape near the water's edge. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. It moved with a jerky, inhuman grace, its limbs impossibly long and spindly. It stood there for a moment, seemingly unaware of my presence. "Davy?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature whipped around, the movement so fast it almost looked like a glitch in reality. The darkness concealed most of it, but I could still make out its outline, a long, withered body, arms reaching almost to the ground, and where its head should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless expanse. The creature lurched toward me, its movements jerky and unsettling. A wave of nausea washed over me as a stench like rotting flesh flooded the air. I raised my flashlight, the beam hitting the creature square in its chest, but it seemed unfazed. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. I felt a sharp blow to my hand, sending my flashlight spinning into the darkness. Pain exploded in my wrist. A bone-chilling shriek pierced the air as the creature lunged. I scrambled backwards, my eyes desperately searching the darkness for my flashlight. I tripped over a root, landing hard, the creature's hot, fetid breath washing over me. I fumbled in the dark, finally finding the flashlight. Hitting the power switch, I directed the beam right at the creature. An ear-splitting shriek reverberated through the forest, and the creature recoiled, its skin burning where the beam hit it. I grabbed hold of a fallen branch and swung, my clumsy blow making contact with the creature's shoulder. It let out another chilling scream, stumbling back with a force that shook the ground beneath me. Time seemed to slow down as I stumbled for my dropped gun, fingers fumbling like I'd never handled a weapon before. The stench of decay was overwhelming, making me gag. Finally, my hand closed around the grip, my trembling fingers flicking the safety off. The creature was regaining its footing, its form blurring in the darkness as it lunged again. I fired once, twice, the deafening shots echoing through the forest. The creature screeched, a sound that made my blood run cold, then staggered backwards, clutching at its chest where the bullets had pierced its withered flesh. With every step it took, a dark, viscous trail followed. A flicker of light caught my eye. Gary. He was stumbling out of the woods, clutching at a makeshift torch and a rifle. "Ethan, behind you," he yelled, his voice hoarse. I spun around, but the creature had vanished. The only trace it had left behind was the inky liquid seeping into the ground. Gary lowered his rifle, his breath ragged. "That thing," he gasped. "It ain't natural, Ethan. I know, Gary." The events of the night crashing over me like a wave. We made our way back to the pickup, the silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. I felt a strange hollowness inside of me, like something fundamental had shifted within. Gary slumped into the driver's seat, exhaustion etched on his face. "Gotta get word out," he muttered. "More Rangers. Need backup. Can't let it take others." He started the engine, the headlights slicing through the darkness. As we pulled away, I couldn't help but look back at the base of the falls. The mist danced and swirled, concealing whatever secrets might lay hidden within. The rest is a blur. The frantic radio calls, the arrival of a full team of Rangers, and the search that lasted days. We found Davy's remains tucked into an unseen crevice near the falls, his body torn apart. The creature, however, vanished without a trace. It was as if it had been swallowed by the very earth itself. Officially, the case was filed as an animal attack, but I knew, we all did, that what lurked in Yosemite's shadow was something far more sinister. Gary retired soon after. They say he moved up north, someplace remote. Some say the guilt was too much for him. Others whisper he hunts the creature still, obsessed with vengeance for his lost crewmen. As for me, they put me on leave, said I needed a break from the stress. Truth is, I'd seen things nobody should ever have to witness, and it changes a person. Years passed. I did go back to Yosemite eventually. I couldn't stay away from the mountains, but it was never the same. There's a chill in the air, a quiet late at night when the wind whispers through the pines. I swear I hear a shriek in the distance, a hollow, chilling sound that makes my blood run cold. The locals started whispering about the shrieker of the falls, a creature of shadow and myth. They tell tales of hikers vanishing into the mist, snatched by something unseen and monstrous. I stay silent, knowing the awful truth behind the legend. Maybe one day that thing will resurface from whatever dark hole it crawled into, and maybe one day I'll be there to stop it. I owe Davy at least that much. Until then, all I can do is listen to those chilling whispers on the wind and remember the night I faced the unfathomable and barely survived. My name is Andrew Thunderbird, 35 years old, and this story is from a year that feels like a lifetime ago. I was born and raised in the small town of Wellesley, Massachusetts. Not much happens here, which is why what I'm about to tell you is even more bizarre. It started innocuously enough. I was fresh out of college, back in my hometown, working a dead-end job at the local hardware store. Not exactly the life I'd envisioned, but hey, it paid the bills. My girlfriend Lacey had just moved in with me. We were both trying to save up for something better, but at least we had each other. One evening my buddy Owen called. "Bryce, you up for a camping trip this weekend?" Just the guys like old times. Owen always had a knack for pulling me out of my funk. "Sure, why not?" I replied. I figured a weekend in the woods might clear my head. Friday rolled around and we packed up Owen's beat-up truck with all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, and a decent stash of beer. It was me, Owen, Kyle, and Benny. We headed out to a spot in the Berkshires, a place we'd camped a few times before. It was quiet and far from the hassles of daily life. We got there just before dusk, set up camp, and lit a fire. The night was filled with laughter and stories. It was like we were kids again, with no responsibilities, no worries. Around midnight, I decided to hit the sack. The others were still up, talking and joking. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I could hear their voices fading into the background, mingling with the sounds of the forest. I woke up to silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I checked my watch, 3 a.m. I sat up and noticed that Owen, Kyle, and Benny were all fast asleep. I stepped out of the tent to stretch my legs and take a leak. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. As I stood there, I heard a rustling noise in the trees. Probably a deer or some other animal, I thought. But then I saw it, a shadowy figure moving among the trees. It was tall, hunched over, and moving with an unsettling grace. My first thought was that it was a bear, but something about its shape was all wrong. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. The figure stopped, turned towards me, and then vanished into the darkness. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I finished up and went back to the tent, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning I told the guys about what I'd seen. Owen laughed it off. "You probably had one too many beers. Nothing out here but us and the wildlife." The others agreed, and we went about our day, hiking and exploring the area. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting around the fire again, talking about old times, when we heard a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a woman, but there was something primal about it, something that chilled me to the bone. "What the hell was that?" Kyle asked, his face pale. Benny, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's Bigfoot, or worse, Kyle's ex-girlfriend." We laughed nervously, but the tension was palpable. We decided to check it out, grabbing flashlights and heading in the direction of the scream. The woods were dense, and the beams of our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. After about 10 minutes, we came across a small clearing. In the middle of it was a deer, or what was left of one. It had been torn apart, its insides strewn across the grass. "Oh my God," Benny whispered. "What could have done this?" "Mountain lion, maybe?" Owen suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We heard another rustle in the trees, and all our flashlights swung towards the sound. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was taller than I'd realized, easily 7 feet, with long, matted hair and glowing eyes that reflected the light from our flashlights. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. We didn't stop until we were back at the fire, panting and wide-eyed. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Agreed," Owen said. "Let's pack up and leave. Now." We scrambled to gather our things, tossing them haphazardly into the truck. The forest around us seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. Just as we were about to get in the truck, Benny screamed. We turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the campsite, its eyes locked onto us. Without thinking, I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and hurled it at the creature. It let out a roar and retreated into the woods. And Owen didn't need to be told twice. We sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing over the rough terrain. The moonlight flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the windshield. We drove for what felt like hours until we reached a small town. We found a diner that was still open and stumbled inside, disheveled and shaken. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, looked at us with concern. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring us coffee. "Something like that," I muttered. We told her a sanitized version of what had happened, just enough to explain why we were so rattled. She listened, nodding occasionally. "You know, there are old legends about these woods," she said. "Stories of creatures that aren't quite human. Most folks dismiss them as just that, stories. But you never know." We spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too afraid to sleep. The next morning we drove back to Wellesley in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never spoke about that night again, not really. It was like an unspoken pact, a way to keep the fear at bay. Lacey noticed a change in me right away. "Bryce, what happened out there?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a weird trip. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. None of us were. Owen moved to another state a few months later, saying he needed a fresh start. Kyle and Benny drifted away, their laughter and jokes now tinged with an edge of unease. As for me, I stayed in Wellesley, but I never went camping again. I sold my gear, got a new job, and tried to put that night behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scream, and I wonder what it was that we saw out there in the woods. Life went on, as it does, but the shadows of that night never entirely left me. I married Lacey, and we had 2 kids. I took up woodworking, finding solace in the rhythm of carving and shaping. The routine helped, but the memory lingered. One evening, years later, I was working in my garage when Owen called out of the blue, "Bryce, we need to talk." We met at a bar halfway between our towns, the kind of place where no one asked questions, more worn than I remembered. We ordered beers and sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. "I can't stop thinking about it," Owen finally said. "That night. I've tried to move on, but it's always there, like a shadow." I nodded. "Same here. What do you think it was?" Owen took a deep breath. "I don't know, but I've been doing some research. There are stories, old legends about creatures in those woods. They say it's something ancient, something that preys on people who wander too far." I shivered, remembering the creature's eyes. "So what do we do?" Owen shrugged. "I don't think there's anything we can do. Just live our lives, I guess." But I had to talk to someone who understands. We stayed there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, trying to make sense of the senseless. It didn't bring closure, but it helped to know I wasn't alone in my fear. As the years passed, the memory of that night faded but never disappeared. I grew old, watching my children grow up and start families of their own. I told them stories about my youth, but I never mentioned that night in the britches. Then one evening my son Max, now a grown man with a family of his own, came to visit. We sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he turned to me with a serious expression. "Dad, do you remember that camping trip you went on years ago, the one you never talk about?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, I remember." Max nodded. "I've been doing some research. There are stories about those woods, stories that go back centuries. People talk about seeing things, hearing screams. I think you saw something real, something that shouldn't be there." I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of old fears. "Maybe. But there's no point in dwelling on it. We survived, and that's what matters." Max nodded, but I could see the curiosity and determination in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know that I believe you, Dad. Whatever it was, you're not alone." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. Maybe the past would never fully let go, but I had my family, and that was enough. Life is full of mysteries, some better left unexplored. I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But I've learned to live with the shadows, to find light in the moments that matter, and that's enough for me. When I was younger, around 12 years old, My parents booked a 4-night stay at a log cabin somewhere in California with my grandma. The events that occurred scarred me for life. I felt the crisp air on my face as I opened the car door. I looked at the woods around me and then started towards the cabin door. My mother called after me, "Ed, sweetie, why don't you go up to your room and unpack your things?" When I opened the cabin door, I was surprised at the sudden creak it made. The cabin was a large space with a sofa parked in front of a flat-screen TV. There was a kitchen attached to the living room. It had an counter that sat bar stools. I walked up the stairs and past the bathroom. Down the hall, I entered the room I was supposed to be staying in and screamed. There was a dead rat in the middle of the floor. It looked like something had been gnawing on it. Its insides had been smeared everywhere. I bolted down the stairs and saw my dad wheeling my grandma's wheelchair in the cabin. "Dad, there's a dead rat in my room," I practically screamed. "You're old enough, why don't you clean it up?" Eventually, I used an entire paper towel and a can of Lysol to clean it all up. It was around 6 p.m. when my mom made some mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs, my favorite at the time. I was walking to the couch Grandma was next to with my bowl when I noticed something. There was a trap door in the middle of the room. How had I not noticed it before? "Mom, what's this door doing here?" I asked my mother. "Oh, it's probably a crawl space, Ed. They're used to keep floods from coming into the cabin." I sat down on the couch and turned on the TV. I vividly remember how much I liked the food. It was great. Finally, it was time for bed. My dad had told me in the car how much fishing and kayaking we were going to do. I was pretty excited. I got in my bed and fell asleep, the warm covers comforting me. Around 12 a.m. I woke to this shuffling sound. I stepped out of my room, leaving the door slightly ajar. As I peered into the dusty hall, I noticed nothing but the moon-lit shadows dancing on the wall. The shuffling sound continued as I crept down the stairs leading to the living room. I placed my ear to the floor, and just as I suspected, the sounds were coming from under the floorboards. Dread washed over me as the fear of something scurrying around under there hit me. Being the idiot I was, I thought I could take whatever was down there on. So I grabbed my flashlight and decided I should go in. I opened the trap door and thousands of rats scattered as I climbed down into the cold, damp space. It was huge and reminded me disturbingly of a maze. I crawled deeper into the darkness. I can't tell if I was being really brave or really stupid. I crawled until I reached a dimly lit corner about 10 feet in front of me. Suddenly there was movement, and I shone my flashlight at whatever was there. It was this long-armed and pale figure hunched in the corner. Its eyes reflected white off my flashlight. I was completely stunned as the thing started to screech. Looking back, I noticed the flashlight probably hurt its eyes. I turned myself around and started to crawl as fast as I could. I glanced back, and the thing was chasing me, wrapping its enormously long fingers around the support beams. I guess it had been feeding off of the rats, and now it wanted something different, something bigger, me. I was lost. The thing gaining on me with every foot I moved. I thought all hope was lost until I spotted the trap door. As soon as I reached it, I pushed it open and scrambled to get out. The thing started grabbing at me, its mouth gaping. I was in a hurry, so please excuse the lack of details. I kicked it away and slammed the trap door closed. The thing was clawing and pushing at it, so I threw my body on top of the door. After a while, the thrashing stopped, and I bolted upstairs and reached my parents' bedroom. "Dad, Mom!" I shouted as I banged on the door. My dad groggily opened the door and asked what I was doing. "Dad, we gotta go. Something's trying to get in the house." But he didn't believe me. Tried to explain it wasn't a nightmare, but it was pointless. I didn't get any more sleep that night. I was too scared to sleep. That morning I ate my breakfast and went out on the lake with my dad. He got the fishing rods set up and we got on the little boat. I didn't catch any fish, but I enjoyed spending time with my father. Anything to get my mind off of last night's events. Eventually, dawn turned to dusk and we started to roast marshmallows. An activity both Grandma and Mom loved. They used to go camping when my mother was younger. The s'more I made was delicious, perfectly gooey. It was finally bedtime. I was terrified of the thought of that creature trying to attack my family. I didn't think I could sleep, but somehow eventually I managed to doze off. I awoke then, right there. I heard the unmistakable sound of the trapdoor creaking open. My heart dropped into my chest as a sense of dread hit me. Right then I heard the sound of cupboards in the kitchen slamming open and shut. Whatever it was looking for me. I started to hyperventilate as I heard the steps creaking. Was my door locked? Could it even open doors? Hundreds of questions went through my mind, but to no avail. I had zero answers. I heard scratching sounds coming from the hallway. The doorknob jiggled and I held my breath. Suddenly everything stopped as I heard another door opening. I heard my dad scream, "Go on! Get out of here! Get!" There was this awful ear-splitting screech and the shatter of glass. I bolted to my door and saw my dad standing just outside of his doorway with his fishing knife. I looked to my right and saw a trail of blood leading to a shattered window. That night we packed our things and left the cabin. We never went anywhere near the woods since. Remember to keep safe as best as you can. If you hear strange noises, don't hesitate to run or call the police, because you might never know what lies near you just beneath your feet. Hi there, I'm Mallow, and I'm 23 years old. I used to live in Canada until my husband and I moved to Florida. Just recently, my brother told me this story. I'll be telling this from his point of view, and from how he's telling it to me. Hi, I'm Keith, and this story happened a few years ago. Me and my boyfriend, Theo, were 20 when this happened. Me and Theo had just gotten into a big fight. We were fuming and hadn't talked to each other for a few days. Finally, my sister Mallow told me to reach out and ask him if he wanted to do something like camping or hiking. I knew Theo liked being outdoors and enjoyed spending time with me. "Oh, come on, Keith," Mallow urged. I agreed to talk to him and take him up to Niagara. I left the living room and headed upstairs. Once I made it into my room, I closed the door and made the phone call. It rang a few times before someone answered. "Keith?" "Theo, I'm sorry. I was wondering if I could try to make this better." The phone was silent for a few moments before Theo spoke again. "What were you thinking about doing?" I sighed in relief and told him about my thoughts. He agreed and said he couldn't wait. "I'll pick you up tomorrow," I said, trying to hide my excitement. "See you then," Theo said. I hung up and started packing for the trip to Niagara the next day. After a good night's sleep, I went downstairs with my hand in my sweater pockets. I went into the kitchen and peered out the window above the sink. My sister's car was missing. I ignored this and made myself some eggs and toast. When the sizzling eggs started moving, I reached for the spatula. I placed them on my flower-decorated plate and sat down at the marble table. I ate quickly and hurried out the front door. I walked out to my red Volvo and got into the driver's seat, pushing the key into the ignition. I left the driveway and headed for Theo's place. Skipping ahead a little bit, I had just made it to Theo's house. I found him sitting on the steps leading to the front door. He was looking at his phone with his headphones on. I sat there for a few moments, waiting for Theo to look up, but he didn't. I honked the horn, a bit annoyed. His head shot up and he looked at me surprised. He smiled brightly and got into the front seat, throwing his bag in the back. "I missed you," he said as I started driving. "Same here," I said, glancing at him quickly. He grabbed my hand and squeezed gently. I smiled and kept my eyes fixed to the road. It was a few hours from where Theo lived to Niagara, so on the way there we passed the time by talking about what had happened the past few weeks. Skipping further ahead, we had just finished the hike and made it to a nice clearing in the forest. The sky was turning gray and we heard distant thunder booming. Quickly we found a dry spot and threw up the tent. The rain came out of nowhere, pelting down like bullets. "Hurry, Keith," Theo cried, throwing himself into the open tent. I slipped into the tent and zipped the door shut. Theo rolled around, giggling widely. I smiled and laid down, exhausted from the long day. Theo was one of those people who believed in the supernatural, but I always had that see-it-to-believe-it frame of mind. "Can I tell you something?" I asked. Theo sat up and looked down at me. "Of course," Theo said. That weird deer creature you mentioned when we first got together. I think I shot at thee the other day." "The Wendigo?" "Yeah, that thing, the Wendigo." Theo stiffened and shook his head with a worried expression. "Don't say its name." "Why? Are you scared?" "Wendigo, Wendigo, Wendigo," I teased. "Shut up," Theo hissed. Little did I know saying its name only made everything worse. I got into my sleeping bag and slept next to Theo. I actually chatted with him for a little bit before I did that, but it's not important. The next morning I woke up and shivered. A cold morning dew covered the tent. I went outside to relieve myself. I walked a little ways from the tent and walked through a fog which seemed to come out of nowhere. After I was done doing my business, I zipped up my pants and walked back towards the tent, or at least in the direction I thought the tent was. I stumbled around in the fog for what seemed like hours. "Keith?" Theo called. "I'm over here," I called back. "Keith." I paused for a moment thinking about what direction his voice came from. That was the weird thing, though. His voice seemed to be coming from every direction. "Come on, Keith," Theo called. I stood there looking around nervously. I didn't think this was Theo, but if it wasn't, what was imitating his voice so perfectly? A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered Theo telling me, "The Wendigo can mimic voices perfectly, but if you go towards it, there's a chance you might never come back." I backed away from where I thought the voice was coming from, although I was disoriented and couldn't think straight. A shiver rushed down my spine again, but this time it was due to how I'd bumped into something hard. I froze, thinking it was probably a tree or something, but this thing was breathing on my neck. Now keep in mind, I'm 6'4", so it's not every day something breathes on me. I spun around quickly and screamed. This was a deer, but it was wrong. It was standing on its back legs and showing its sharp yellow teeth in an evil smile. It slowly started walking towards me, getting on all fours and growling. I backed away and observed its features. It had long claws that dug into the ground as it walked. It had chunks missing from its body, and it smelled like rotting flesh. I ran in the opposite direction of the creature. I felt it chasing after me as I ran. I didn't look back, I just ran. Ahead of me the fog ended. This was unusual, but I was thankful because I could make out the tent's outline. I burst out of the fog and fell to the ground, breathing deeply. Theo unzipped the tent and glanced at me with a worried look. "Are you okay?" "We need to leave," I demanded, getting to my feet and grabbing everything outside the tent. Theo did not question me. He packed everything up and threw it into his bag. Now it was time to hike back. Theo stood by my side as we made our way back to the car. I glanced around, looking for anything out of the ordinary. My eyes skimmed past a few trees. That's when I caught a glimpse of it. But when I looked back to where it was gone. "Did you see it?" Theo asked. I nodded, still looking at the trees. He grabbed my hand and pecked my cheek. I looked at him, smoldering a little bit. I looked back into the forest. "Hey, Keith," Theo said. "Yeah?" I asked, looking back at him. His face went pale and sweat dripped down his forehead. "That wasn't me," he said, sending a chill through me. My heart started to race. "We gotta ditch the bags," I said, stopping and dropping my backpack. Theo did the same and started walking faster. We took turns glancing into the forest and looking ahead. I stepped over a few tree roots and sighed. We were about halfway done with the hike. Skipping ahead a little bit, me and Theo stopped to take a break. He was tired and sat down on a rock. I just noticed how everything had been quiet and that I couldn't even hear my footsteps. Theo stood up quickly and started walking again. He turned to look back and shrieked. I also looked back and cried out too. About 10 yards behind us was the creature from before. It was walking fairly quickly and had its tongue dragging against the ground, as if it was trying to taste us. Theo and I ran as quickly as we could. "Why did you have to say its name?" Theo yelled at me. "I didn't think it was real," I said, still sprinting. A smell hit me. It came out of nowhere and was blinding my senses. It stung my eyes and made me gag. Theo screamed as he fell to the ground. I stopped abruptly and ran back to him. I helped him up as the creature neared. We dashed, but the Wendigo caught the back of my shirt. I yelped as it threw me to the ground. It crawled on top of me and pushed down on my chest. The air inside of me was forced out as it pushed down harder. I screamed in pain as I felt my ribs break under the pressure of this horrid creature. Theo smashed a stick against the Wendigo's head. It shrieked and let go of me. It turned to Theo and hissed. I stood up and grabbed Theo's hand as we both began to sprint again. I looked back and saw that it stopped chasing us. We burst out of the forest and fell to the ground exhausted. Theo started laughing. "Suck it, Wendigo!" he screamed into the forest. He started laughing again. I cried out in pain as I tried to get up. "Keith, you're bleeding," Theo said, rushing to my side. "You saved me," I said, looking at him. "Well, no duh, but you're bleeding," Theo said. My eyes felt heavy suddenly. "Don't close your eyes," Theo said, his voice slurring. He was screaming at me, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Tears ran down Theo's face as everything started going black. I awoke in a fully white room. A heart monitor beeped beside me. I was confused for a second before remembering the past events. Someone grabbed my hand, causing me to jump. "I was so worried," Theo said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm fine," I said, looking at the rib belt around me. "It was really bad," Theo said, gesturing to my ribs. "It hurts really bad," I said, taking short breaths. 17 broken ribs, Keith," Theo said, shaking his head. "That's the last time I saw Wendigo. At least I hope it is. I'm 27 now and I'm married to Theo. We still talk about the beast that caused breathing problems for me, but we never say its name for we fear it will come back." When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of 3, I assumed this responsibility with no pay, nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd, in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read in perfect contentment for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said more clearly this time, "did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." "Knocking on window?" I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought. But being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy, in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought, but what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. Kate. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart thumped in my chest. "This is silly," I told myself. "Be a man." I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars Battlefront's Game Paused screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing, just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed, at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes, a man's shoes. None of my friends wore the size, of that I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. "No, no, no, shh," I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move, do you understand? Do not move." "I need to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones. So I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him, and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident at age 11, forever 11, never growing up. Frozen in time, in the memories of all who knew him as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what, I could not hear. I stared, transfixed, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I felt. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy, beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished, and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me, and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me, and ran to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. "No, no more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it was trying to be quiet. I silently guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand or maybe the hutch. "He's here," the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the fucking toilet," I snarled at him, the first time I had ever said that word. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once he almost slipped back down, but he was stronger than I thought he was, and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold!" screamed Georgie as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light off in the distance, the Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life, but that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight I could see Georgie had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds maybe, and finally reached the Garlands' front door. The window into their parlor was open and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work, and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room in the dead of night. Then, and then alone, is when the real fear sets in. The events described herein happened a long time ago, more than a decade in fact, but I still remember most of the details quite clearly. For a little bit of context, I was born and raised in a small rural town in the southeastern U.S., but at the time of this story, a sizable enclave of my family lived in the backwoods of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Once a year, my parents and I would pile into the car and make the trip up to see my Michigan relatives, and we would all converge on a small campground on the shores of Lake Superior for a 3 or 4 day reunion. I always looked forward to it, because it always meant several days of enjoying good, home-cooked food by the lake shore with family. I especially loved seeing all of my cousins who were similar ages to me. Plus, most of the older family members would either be preoccupied with catching up on gossip or busy making casseroles and other dishes for the cookout. This meant that all of the kids were free to roam the beautiful shoreline of the lake, or go hiking in the woods, or just generally be free from our parents. It was a real blast. At the time that this story happened, I would have been 13 years old. Likewise, 2 of my cousins, Erica and Cody, were the same age as me, and another cousin named Dan was 2 years younger. Erica and Cody and I always hung out together at the reunion since we were all the same age. The older cousins were too grown up to bother with us, but we were too old to be stuck with the little kids. Dan was in between, too old for the kindergartners, but too young for us big and mature middle schoolers. He was funny and nice, though, so we would usually let him hang with us. Anyway, on the first day of the reunion, we did all of the usual running around and swimming, but we decided that this year we should do something more daring, since we were practically grown-ups now. To that end, we asked our cousin Bradley if there were any scary places nearby for us to explore. Bradley was kind of a jerk sometimes, but he was the youngest of the older cousins, so he was the most approachable. Besides, he was in ROTC at his high school and carried a pocket knife all the time, so he was pretty much as good as a space marine as far as we were concerned. Bradley acted annoyed at first, but eventually he caved and told us about a creepy abandoned farm that bordered the campground on one side. The fields were still used for growing wheat and corn, even though the house and equipment shed were run down and dilapidated. He told us a spooky tale of how the farmer who lived there had gone insane and started kidnapping local children and eating them. Of course, this story was completely made up just to scare us, but at the time it sure seemed real enough to us. So with visions of insane, fang-toothed cannibal farmers in our heads, we all decided this would be a great place to explore to show that we were fearless adults. We spent the rest of the evening biding our time, and once our parents were all asleep, we snuck out of our cabins and met at one of the picnic areas. Erica was there first, and I arrived just a few minutes before Cody, but Dan didn't show for a while. Just when we assumed he had chickened out, though, he finally came trotting down the path from his cabin. After a little bit of teasing, we decided that we should go ahead and get moving if we wanted to get back in time to catch a little bit of sleep. We had all brought flashlights, and Erica had brought her new camera since she was going through a photographer phase at the time. The campground wasn't really that big, so we were able to make it to its edge on foot in just over half an hour. We hopped the ramshackle split-rail fence bordering the campground, and we could see the old farmhouse in the distance. There was just one problem. It was on the far side of a head-high cornfield. But, not willing to be deterred from our little investigation into the property, we made our way into the moonlit field. The corn wasn't quite ready to be harvested, so it was at least green and lush, not dry and creepy. And in the midst of the foliage, the air was refreshingly damp and cool as we walked. We whispered to one another about what we would do if we encountered the cannibal farmer, and we teased one another with pokes and prods, seeing who was on edge and jumpy. Finally, we reached the edge of the cornfield, and the terrain opened up into an overgrown grassy yard surrounding the single-story farmhouse and a run-down equipment shed. Rusted and neglected farm equipment lay scattered around the yard, surrounded by high grass and weeds, hay balers, box scrapes, cedars, you name it. The place definitely had the creepy vibe we were looking for, maybe even a little bit too much of it. We stood in silence for a moment, then Dan and Cody both suggested we should turn back and return to the cabins, since we had seen what we came for. Erica was braver, though, and she said she wanted to get some pictures of the old shed and the farmhouse. Besides, she said, with a big full moon like that in the sky, I might actually be able to see some of these pictures. If I'm honest, I was feeling a little creeped out myself, but I didn't want to look like a coward, and since we had come all this way, I figured we might as well have a look around. We headed to the equipment shed first, immediately spooking a barn owl with our lights and all but dying of fright when it screeched at us. We poked around in the shed for a few more minutes, the beams of our flashlights casting terrible shadows as they shone across the rusted tines and blades of forgotten machinery. And then we began to move towards the dilapidated house. However, as we walked, we kept hearing a rustling sound, as though somebody was moving out in the cornfield. Every time we stopped to listen, the sound stopped too, almost like it was following us. Erica wouldn't be deterred, though, so we finally made it to the house. The porch was rotted and practically falling in, and attached to the door was a slip of bright orange paper encased in heavy plastic lamination. It read, "Notice of Eviction," and it was dated nearly a year ago. The door was sturdy and locked, and we didn't want to actually break in through one of the windows, so we circled around the building and looked for another way inside. By now the pacing in the cornfield had stopped, so we could all relax a little, assuming it was just a raccoon or something similar. As we rounded the corner to the back of the house, we noticed that the storm cellar doors were wide open, so we figured that would be our ticket inside. However, when we reached the gaping entrance to the cellar, we were greeted with a less than welcoming sight. The concrete floor of the cellar was covered in animal bones and shredded skins. Deer, cattle, raccoons, dogs, birds, all skeletal or mostly skeletal. Likewise, the thick wooden doors of the cellar were covered in scratches and claw marks, like something sharp had been scraping against them regularly. The grass around the entrance to the cellar was worn down, and the dirt was packed from regular traffic. Anybody who has worked in taxidermy or forensics will tell you that old bones have a very particular smell. It's not exactly the signature smell of death or the scent of decay. It's something else entirely, and that cellar absolutely reeked of it. The four of us stood at the entrance of the cellar, open-mouthed and shocked. We stood stone still, as though that would protect us from whatever it was that lived down there. Wordlessly, Dan and Cody backed away, as Erica and I shone our flashlights down into the cellar, looking for any sign that there might be something alive down there. We saw nothing, but the piles of bones and the claw marks on the doors were more than enough to persuade Erica that she didn't really need to get pictures of the inside of the house. We all quickly made the decision to go back the way we came, and we were debating if we should call the police, but then something stopped us in the middle of our whispered argument. A soft asterisk thud asterisk emanated from a rusted hay baler about halfway across the yard, and then came the sound of something sharp scratching against metal. All of us looked at one another, exchanging a wordless, "Did you hear that too?" look. We all shone our flashlights in the direction of the sound, and simultaneously we all saw it. There, atop the rusty green baler, was the shape of a large canine. It was far too big to be a coyote, and its fur was very dark. However, its outline wasn't quite right for a wolf either. Of course, it was hard to focus on anything except for its piercing yellow-green eyes and the carcass of the 2-point buck it held in its jaws. It didn't make any noise, no growling or snarling at all, but we understood the message it was communicating with its glare. Leave. And leave we did. The 4 of us all ran headlong, screaming, into the cornfield, making a desperate break for the safety of the cabins. Just as I was running into the field, however, I looked over my shoulder, making sure that the beast wasn't following us. It wasn't, but when I looked back, what I saw was almost as unsettling. The thing had stood up. It was standing on its hind legs, now holding the deer carcass in its arms as it watched us leave. I only looked back for a second, but I know what I saw. After that, the whole memory is a blur. I returned to my cabin and bolted inside, and I remember seeing Dan and Cody running by as I was fumbling with the door, followed shortly by Erica. Suddenly, not feeling very grown up, I ran to my bed in the cabin and hid under the sheets, eventually falling asleep. The next morning, I wasn't even sure if everything from the night before was real or just a dream. However, when my cousins and I met up after breakfast, we all agreed that what we had seen was real. When I mentioned that I had looked back and seen the monster stand up, Dan and Erica suggested that maybe it was Bradley playing a prank on us, since wolves obviously don't stand on 2 legs. Except Cody then told us that when he had returned to his cabin, Bradley had been sound asleep on the couch, and there's no way he could have beaten us home without us ever having seen him, running ahead of us. And where the heck had he gotten such an elaborate costume? Besides, even though Bradley was a pretty big guy already at 15, he's a 6'5" Marine nowadays for context, he definitely wasn't big enough to account for the height of the thing I had seen the night before. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with farm equipment, but a full-size round baler is a big piece of machinery, and this thing was more than half the height of the baler it was standing atop, making it easily 7 or 8 feet tall. I'm not sure what it was that we saw, but to this day, whenever I talk to my cousin Erica, the subject of that night almost always comes up. She still says her biggest regret is not stopping to take a picture of that basement full of bones, or the creature as it stood silhouetted against the brilliant light of the summer moon, but I always tell her that she did the right thing just running. The 4 of us have never told the rest of our family about our experience there, and the farmhouse and outbuildings have since been torn down. Most of my family from that area has either died or moved away now, so we don't have the yearly reunions anymore. But I'll never forget what I saw that night, and if I ever go back there, I'll be sure to be armed. After all, who knows if that thing is still out there? If you ever go out walking in the woods and farmland of the Upper Peninsula, take heed. There's something out there with claws, teeth, and a lot of fur. It walks on 2 legs, and when you meet it, it might be hungry. I had completely forgotten about these events until, 20 years later, I hooked up with my buddy Rob when we found ourselves in the same unit deploying to Afghanistan. Fort Riley in Kansas is the home of the famous U.S. Army 1st Infantry Division and is one of the Army's oldest and most haunted posts. While I was a member of the Big Red One, the nickname for the 1st Infantry Division, I served as a member of the division's Air Defense Battalion. We had a live fire exercise coming up, and so the day before, we had a 2.5-ton truck called a Deuce and a Half, loaded with thousands of 20mm ammunition rounds for our M163 Vulcan tracks, which we would fire at remote-controlled drones the next day. The truck with the ammunition was parked in what was called an ammunition staging area, or ASA, located somewhere deep in the forest. The ammunition needed to be guarded at all times prior to the unit picking it up and transporting it to the firing point, and me and my battle buddies Jerry and Rob were detailed to be the night guards. We were all just privates at the time, and we dutifully piled in the back of a HMMWV along with our sleeping gear, flashlights, books, and anything else we thought we needed to pass the time, along with jugs of water, a case of MREs, and a cooler of iced drinks. We were also armed with 2 hardwood batons about 3 feet long, just in case. The driver of the HMMWV was the sergeant of the guard named Sergeant Herring. He was a short man who was overweight, out of shape, and had the reputation of being a lazy and not a particularly effective squad leader. Sergeant Herring drove us down the hardball road out behind the battalion motor pool, which turned off onto the tank trails which led to the firing ranges and maneuver training areas where battalions of 1st Infantry Division tanks and armored fighting vehicles regularly conducted war game exercises. We bounced around in the back for a few miles over meandering fields and low, wooded hills before Sergeant Herring turned off the main tank trail to follow a smaller dirt trail which led deeper into the forest. It was 4 in the afternoon, and the 3 of us stuck in the back of the bouncing cargo compartment of the HMMWV said nothing while we tried to get comfortable and catch a cat nap. Sergeant Herring turned around, backtracked, took different trails, then backtracked again, obviously lost. Finally, however, he found the trail that he needed to take, which led us down into a shallow valley. He was flooring the HMMWV down the winding trail, which was only wide enough to allow 1 vehicle which jostled us around even more in the back. Recklessly, Sergeant Herring followed the dirt trail up a slight incline which led to another hardball road. The incline led to a low plateau with a square compound built on it. The compound was simply a concrete parking lot about a quarter-mile square surrounded by 2 chain-linked fences topped with razor wire. Parked in the center of the parking lot underneath the lights was the deuce-and-a-half truck with the ammunition. 2 one-story shacks were built outside the fence next to the gate which led into the fenced-in parking lot, and Sergeant Herring parked the HMMWV next to the smaller of the 2 shacks. "Get your gear and get the hell out," yelled Sergeant Herring from the driver's compartment. "This is going to be home until we're relieved tomorrow." Me, Rob, and Jerry jumped out the back of the HMMWV and gathered our gear. The door to the small shack opened, and another squad leader, a lean, good-natured staff sergeant with a handlebar mustache named Staff Sergeant Sleet, came out saying, "You're late, Sergeant Herring. It's almost 1800 hours. My guys are going to miss dinner chow at the mess hall. Did you get lost again?" "No, I did not get lost," said Sergeant Herring, offended. But we just smiled and nodded at Staff Sergeant Sleet behind Sergeant Herring's back. 3 other soldiers emerged from the larger shack, which turned out to be the guard shack. They were friends of ours from Staff Sergeant Sleet's squad who had the day shift guard duty. We exchanged greetings as they piled into the HMMWV to go back to the main post at Fort Riley, their duty day completed. Staff Sergeant Sleet climbed into the driver's seat and said, "Hey, Sergeant Herring, 1st Platoon will be coming to relieve you at 0800 tomorrow. They'll be bringing out hot chow for breakfast." Staff Sergeant Sleet then yelled back at his team, "Hey guys, we aren't going to make chow time tonight, so pizza is on me. Sergeant Herring got lost again." The soldiers in the back of the HMMWV laughed as Staff Sergeant Sleet pulled away from the compound. As they turned onto the dirt trail, my buddy Paul, who was sitting in the back of the HMMWV, suddenly yelled to me, Rob, and Jerry, "Hey, watch out for ghosts. They say this ASA is haunted." We stood there watching the HMMWV disappear, and I turned to Sergeant Herring and said, "What did he mean by this ASA is haunted?" "Nothing, it's nothing," replied Sergeant Herring, sounding angry and flustered. Sergeant Herring pointed at the larger shack and said, "Throw your gear in there. That's where you 3 will be spending the night. You'll each be doing roving patrols around the perimeter of the fence in 1-hour shifts." "You!" Sergeant Herring pointed at me. "I saw how you laughed when Sleet said I got lost. You pull first guard rotation. Get out there." "Do we have radios?" I asked. "You know, in case of ghosts." "Knock it off," said Herring. "We don't need comms because there's no such thing as ghosts." In other words, Sergeant Herring had forgotten to bring the radios, meaning we had no communication between the ASA and our headquarters if something unexpected should occur way out here in the middle of nowhere. Sergeant Herring gathered his gear, including a portable television, a cooler, and a mini grill, and stomped off towards the smaller guard shack that was meant for the sergeant of the guard and had electricity and air conditioning. Jerry and Rob took our gear and walked towards the guard shack while I secured one of the wooden batons and began my patrol around the perimeter fence. Each side of the fence was a quarter-mile long, and a small path circled the outside of the fenced lot. The guard shacks were located on the eastern side of the fence. The north and south sides of the fence were clear of foliage, and the plateau dipped steadily about 10 to 20 feet down towards the forest. On the west side, however, the forest grew right up to the fence line. I began walking around the perimeter, enjoying the sounds of nature, the cool breeze, and the crimson sky as the sun slowly set in the west. When I turned the corner to walk the western side of the fence, however, the trees seemed to swallow all light and it felt colder, although there was no breeze. Also, there didn't seem to be any animal noises, such as birds chirping. I completed that quarter-mile stretch, and when I emerged on the north side of the fence, the birds' chirping noise returned. I completed the circuit about 4 times before my hour was up, and I returned to the guard shack where Jerry was getting ready for his shift. I didn't say anything about how weird I felt walking the quarter-mile section of the western perimeter and just rolled out my sleeping bag on the bare concrete floor, heated up an MRE meal of tuna with noodles, and washed it down with an iced soda from the cooler while talking with Rob about when he was going to get up with that exotic dancer from Tiger Island in Junction City. An hour later, Jerry had completed his shift and Rob left to take his turn. It was getting darker and there was no electricity in our guard shack, so Jerry and I just sat around eating snacks while Jerry bugged me about when I was going to get up with that exotic dancer at Tiger Island in Junction City. At 9 p.m., Rob had completed his shift, and I got up to begin my second guard rotation. Rob handed me the baton and a flashlight. "Here," he said, "you'll need this." "Hey, thanks," I said. Then I noticed that Rob seemed a bit nervous. "You all right, man?" I said. "Yeah," answered Rob. "It's just that the flashlight seems to go dim on the western perimeter where the woods go all the way up to the fence." Probably just because of the trees." "Yeah, probably," I said. "Or maybe it's ghosts." I stepped outside of the shack and breathed in the warm night air, grateful for the breeze. The moon was out and full, which bathed everything in a soft light. The lights inside the ASA were lit and shone brightly down on our ammunition truck. Lights were also on in Sergeant Herring's shack, although he had pulled down the blinds. Even at this distance, I could hear the sounds of a porn movie being played on his television. I shuddered and hoped he had also locked the door. The perimeter lights were on and shining brightly on the north, south, and east sides of the fence, but for some reason the lights on the west side had failed to come on. When I turned the corner of the western perimeter, everything seemed to go pitch black. I could clearly see all sides of the perimeter, but the western side was totally dark, even with the full moon shining. I turned on the flashlight that Roy gave me, and sure enough, it was weak, as if low on battery. The fence was on my right and the forest was to my left as I walked that portion of the perimeter. The flashlight barely illuminated the path and trees 5 feet in front of me, and the whole time I felt as if I were being watched by something. I cursed at Paul for putting the thought in my head that this place was haunted, and secretly hoped that he caught an STD from that exotic dancer from Tiger Island. The quarter-mile walk down the dark western perimeter seemed to take hours, but eventually I made it to the corner where the forest was no longer at the fence line and the perimeter lights worked. The moon shone brightly in the sky, and, for some reason, my flashlight shined a powerful beam of light again. Curious, I turned around and walked back the way I came, and my flashlight dimmed like before. Stupid flashlight. I completed my 4 circuits around the perimeter fence, north, east, south, then west, but always dreading the west side. As I said earlier, it felt as if someone or something was watching me from somewhere inside the inky black void of the forest. At 10 p.m. my shift was up and Jerry met me at the shack, ready to take his turn as the roving guard. The sound of a porn movie was still coming from Sergeant Herring's shack, and Jerry rolled his eyes and shook his head. 3 hours straight, he said, and we both laughed. I handed Jerry the baton and told him about the flashlight issue, but did not mention how creeped out I felt walking the western perimeter. Jerry thanked me, warned me that the MRE chili mac that Rob ate for dinner was causing him to pass gas in his sleep, then put on headphones before beginning his guard shift. I walked into the now pitch-black guard shack and felt my way to my sleeping bag. Thinking I was too wired up to sleep, I quickly fell asleep. I woke up at 11 p.m. when Jerry's shift was over, listening to Rob tell Jerry that the MRE tuna with noodles that I had for dinner was making me pass gas in my sleep. It was dark inside the shack, save for the moonlight streaming in from the windows and open door. Jerry responded but sounded rather worried, scared even. Jerry mentioned hearing something on the western side of the fence, but he couldn't make it out. He said it sounded like horses and the thunder of hooves, but it sounded faint. Feeling somewhat vindicated, I said to Rob as he left for his patrol, "Don't let the ghosts get you." Midnight came quickly, and I was pulling on my boots to begin my shift. Of course, I would get the midnight shift. I met Rob at the front of the shack, and perhaps it was a trick of light from the moon, but at that moment Rob was the whitest black guy I had seen. He didn't look at me, but kept staring out at the western perimeter. "Man, there is definitely something out there," Rob said. "Every time I walk that part of the fence, the flashlight gets dim and I keep hearing something." "Something," I said. "I haven't heard anything." "You will," said Rob. "It sounds like, I don't know, like horses and yelling, but really faint, just like Jerry said." "Go get some sleep, man," I said as I nervously took the baton and the flashlight from Rob. "I'll take care of Casper for you. I have to warn you, though, that you might want to keep the window open. The MRE spaghetti and meatballs that Jerry had for dinner is making him pass gas in his sleep." So now it was my turn, and it was midnight. Admittedly, with some trepidation, I walked the south perimeter fence and turned to walk the western side. Once again, as soon as I turned the corner, my flashlight dimmed as I walked that dark quarter-mile corridor. I felt as I was not even there, as if I was somehow outside myself and I was watching myself walking underwater. Yes, it felt as if I were underwater, as it had grown cold, and the air felt thick and hard to breathe. A mist had also risen up, further obscuring what little I could see ahead of me. The lights indicating the north perimeter seemed miles away. Then, about halfway down the western perimeter fence, I heard something off to my left, coming deep from within the forest. It sounded like horses galloping back and forth. It was faint, but it was definitely there. There was also something else. It was a feeling somewhat akin to panic, but it wasn't something I was feeling. It was just like I knew there was panic, but it wasn't coming from me. I completed my first circuit around the fence and almost eagerly walked at a quick pace to get to the western side. Once again, the warm night air was replaced by an almost graveyard-type cold and mist. At about the same spot, I could hear it again, the sounds drifting in from somewhere in the dark forest of horses running. But this time it seemed closer than before, the sounds more distinct. Also, I could hear some of the horses whinnying, as if they were in pain. I tried to shake it off, still arguing with myself that this was just my imagination. The thought of horses in pain suddenly made me feel sad. "I'm sorry I got you into this, boy. We've been through a lot together. I'm sorry, boy, they ain't taking any prisoners." I ran to the lights marking the north perimeter. What was that? What was that I just felt? It was sadness. But it wasn't mine. What was going on? I looked at my watch under the lights. My shift was almost over, but how? It usually took me 4 circuits around the perimeter, but I had barely gone 2. I completed my circuit and walked back past Sergeant Herring's shack. 5 hours of watching porn, really, Sergeant Herring, and headed towards our guard shack. Jerry was already waiting for me to get back so that he could start his shift. "Anything new and exciting?" Jerry asked. "You'll see," I answered. "What does that mean?" Jerry asked, taking the baton and the flashlight from me. "Did you hear something out on the western side where the forest comes up to the fence?" "I don't know," I answered. "Maybe. Just be careful." I was sitting up on my sleeping bag, leaning my back against the concrete wall and trying to figure out what I had just experienced. Sadness, regret. But they weren't my feelings or my memories. I heard horses whinnying in pain, but I also swear that I heard human voices as well. About 20 minutes later, I heard a pounding on Sergeant Herring's shack. Rob and I got up and opened the door to see Jerry pounding on the door to Sergeant Herring's guard shack and yelling, "What's out there, Sergeant? You know what's out there. What is it?" Sergeant Herring never opened the door. Instead, he yelled from inside his shack, "You just shut your mouth, Private, and do what you're told to do. Stop asking me stupid questions and get back out there, or I will write you up." Rob and I joined Jerry outside of Sergeant Herring's shack, and I said, "Sergeant, it's me, Private Fox. What's out there? What are we dealing with?" Sergeant Herring cursed from behind the door. "Oh, it's Private Fox." "Private McQuestionberry." I said, "Stop asking questions. I swear if you don't shut your mouth and carry out your orders, I will write all of you up for insubordination. Now go away and leave me alone." Sergeant Herring sounded terrified. "Of all the ASAs on this base, they had to put me in charge of this one," Sergeant Herring complained. "You all will be fine. When it gets lighter, I'll show you." "Show us what, Sergeant?" I asked. "I said you'll be fine," screamed Sergeant Herring, as he finally shut off his porn movies and everything went dark inside his shack. "Now go away. Leave me alone." Rob and I offered to go with Jerry to finish his shift, but Jerry declined. "That's fine," Jerry said. "I got this." At this point, I could tell that Jerry was more disgusted with Sergeant Herring than he was afraid of whatever it was on the western perimeter. At 2 a.m., Jerry's shift was over and Rob got up to take his place. Jerry didn't say anything when he got back to our shack and simply shook his head as Rob went out the door. "I'm not sleepy," I said. "You want me to come with you?" "I'm good," answered Rob as he took the baton and the flashlight from Jerry and disappeared out the door. Jerry rolled into his sleeping bag, lost in thought. Although we were all experiencing the same phenomenon, we didn't want to talk about it. We were soldiers with a job to do, and we would do what was required of us. There would be plenty of time to sort out what happened later. I couldn't sleep, so I went outside to get some fresh air. Loud snoring was coming from Sergeant Herring's shack. I looked to the fence line and saw a figure standing under the lights at the south perimeter at the corner. It was Rob. He was standing stark still, staring west into the thick forest. I walked up behind him. "I'm at your 6, Rob," I said so as not to startle him, but he still jumped at my voice. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "You still got another 30 minutes before you have to be on shift." "Can't sleep," I answered. "I can't move," said Rob. "I can't bring myself to turn this corner and walk down that path." "Come on," I said, leading the way. "I'll go with you." As soon as we turned that corner, the flashlight went dim again, and the mist seemed to be chest-high now. The temperature seemed to keep dropping the further we went down the fence line until, again near the middle of that part of the fence, my fingers began to feel numb from the cold, as if I had submerged it in ice. "Stop, stop, stop," whispered Rob. He shined the flashlight into the prevailing darkness, but it barely illuminated the trees which seemed to reach out at us. "Do you hear it?" I nodded. This time the sound was unmistakable. Somewhere out in the distance of that solid black forest, a battle was taking place. The thunder of horses' hooves, the yelling of men, the battle cries of Native Americans, the screams of the dying. It was all there, just beyond the reach of the pathetic illumination from our flashlight. I felt an overwhelming sadness come over me. Somewhere, brave men and horses were fighting and dying, somewhere out there. And then it was gone. Rob's flashlight shone in full brilliance, illuminating the surrounding woods. The mist was gone as if it had never been there, and the cold air was replaced by a cool early morning breeze. I also realized that it had become easier to breathe again, and that the heaviness seemed to have been lifted. Rob and I looked at each other, the sadness also seeming to have vanished, and we simply shrugged. I did my 3 a.m. guard shift around the perimeter, but nothing unusual happened, nor did anything unusual happen on either Jerry or Rob's subsequent shifts. As promised, at 0800 in the morning, 1st Platoon arrived with hot breakfast chow and to take possession of the deuce-and-a-half truck and all of the 20mm ammunition. The sun was rising in the cloudless blue sky, and it promised to be a great day of shooting our Vulcan cannons. Sergeant Herring finally opened the door to his shack, appearing to be nicely rested, and helped himself to the lion's portion of the breakfast chow, while complaining to the first platoon leader about how he doesn't get this new generation of lazy young soldiers. In fact, Sergeant Herring helped himself to so much breakfast chow that Jerry, Rob, and I had to content ourselves with hot coffee and dry cereal. Eager to get out of the ASA, Sergeant Herring yelled at us to get our gear and get in the back of a HMMWV. Jerry, Rob, and I just stared at him. "Sergeant," I said, "last night you said you would show us what was out there when it became light." "Show you? Show you what?" stuttered Sergeant Herring. "I didn't say I was going to show you anything." "Sergeant," said Jerry, "you told us you would show us what was out in those woods." Sergeant Herring cursed again. "Private, I am ordering you to—" "Isn't there a grave around here?" interrupted Lieutenant Cook, the big first platoon leader with the Ranger tab. "You know, Fort Riley used to be a horse cavalry post, and I think it would be a good learning moment to take these young soldiers to see the history of this place. Don't you agree, Sergeant Herring?" Yes, sir," gulped Sergeant Herring. "Do you know where the graves are located, Sergeant Herring?" asked Lieutenant Cook. "Yes," squeaked Sergeant Herring. "Well, take us there, Sergeant," smiled Lieutenant Cook. "I'd like to see it." A visibly pale Sergeant Herring led us, Lieutenant Cook, and about 15 other soldiers from 1st Platoon out to the back of the ASA, where the woods reached the western part of the perimeter. About midway was a small trail which led down off the plateau and into the woods. It was so small and narrow that one would easily overlook it unless they knew exactly where to find it. In the darkness, Jerry, Rob, and I had completely missed seeing it. The trail wound between thick trees and clinging vines as it descended deeper into the valley for about 150 meters before emerging into a clearing about 25 feet square. There, in the middle of the leaf-strewn clearing, were 2 grave markers, each topped with the brass image of a horse. The names on the plaques had faded, so I could not read what was inscribed on them. The morning sun shone down through the trees upon this quiet and solemn place. "Sir," said Sergeant Herring, "buried here are 2 horses from General Custer's cavalry troop. They were killed at the Battle of Little Big Horn and brought back to Fort Riley to be laid to rest." And there you have it. Sergeant Herring had given us the answer to our mystery. None of us ever talked about what happened during our guard duty that night. As a soldier, you learn to accept things as they are, whether they be normal or paranormal, so long as nothing gets in the way of accomplishing the mission. It's just something that happens which soldiers have to adjust to when performing our duties. It did happen in the summer of 2008, 9 years ago from now. I was a kid back in the days, and it was a nice summer. I'm living in Europe. My parents and I love to travel a lot. That summer we traveled to the small but wonderful country Luxembourg. It's a country between Belgium in the west, Germany in the east, and France in the south. It is a country of West Europe. For the story, it's important to know that this country does have a mountainous landscape. When it did happen, so in summer 2008, my parents and I traveled in Luxembourg. We traveled with our car and 2 dogs on the roads until we decided to explore a random place. It was a clear and warm summer day. We were alone. Woods surrounded us. We parked the car on the other side of the road. For us was the small mountain of rock. It was like a wall, very smooth. It was at least as high as a house, and on top were trees. A huge crack separated the 2 wall-like mountains. There was at the end stairs made of rock that led up to the higher area of the place. Before we go further, I want to tell you this. I already did meet ghosts in the past. It did give me always an uneasy feeling, a creepy feeling that I'm unwanted on a place, and I have to go. This time was not different, except this time a ghost did show her, and she, or something else, played, with not much time after. When we walked in the crack, I saw her. She looked like sunshine, a strange, strong light, But this was no sunshine. She did have a bit of orange-like color and looked to us. She waved to us and smiled. My mother made a picture with her camera, and she got the ghost on that picture. I was at that time so afraid and walked right to the ghost. Stupid idea, but I just wanted to walk further. Now it sounded strange that I did not walk away from here, but right into here. When I walked in her, it felt very warm, so warm as the body heat of another person, but it surrounded when I walked in here. When I walked further, the heat was gone instantly. My mother found another path that through another crack. She wanted to explore it more, and she did. There is a graveyard here. I did not wanted to visit that graveyard. What I told you is 100% real.